Now, in a GB News exclusive, Tory leader hopeful and former Home Secretary Suella Braverman has spoken to GB News' US correspondent, Stephen Edgington. Stephen asked about everything from mass migration to the civil service to woke ideology in British institutions, and it was as provocative as ever.
This is a crisis for our party, and if we don't realise the enormity of the problem and fundamentally change, we will have no chance of fixing it. As long as reform continues to exist in the way it is, as long as it keeps taking away millions of voters who used to be part of our voting base, there is no chance that we are going to win elections. There is a consensus, there's an orthodox view, informed mainly by the Treasury, that more people, regardless of where they come from, regardless of what their skills are, regardless of what they're earning, is necessarily a good thing for the economy in terms of growth. I fundamentally refute that because there's a massive oversight there in terms of growth per capita, which has been declining as the population increases, the costs and the pressure on housing supply, on public services, and also on national identity and cultural cohesion. We've got to stop telling the British people that they are racist. We've got to stop trying to guilt white people and branding. We've got to stop branding all English people as racist. One of the first things on my list of things to do when I was Home Secretary was to change the Permanent Secretary. I knew that you need a very good working relationship with your Permanent Secretary if you're a senior minister to get things done. And I knew that I wasn't going to see eye to eye. Unfortunately, you need the Prime Minister's blessing. You can't do it by yourself. And I didn't get it. I believe that only a woman can be pregnant. But the other minister said we needed to use the terminology pregnant person in the legislation to allow me to have some maternity leave.
Well, I'm joined now by my panel, historian broadcaster Tess Dunlop and the author and journalist Emma Woolf. Tessa, Suella is being wonderfully clear about the reasons the Conservatives lost.
Now, hang on a minute.
Yes.
On the subject of Conservatives losing, there's two elephants in the room. One is out there playing football. I've no intention of addressing it because I was born in Scotland. And the second is your loss as a Conservative. But I want to reassure you, Jacob, from the ashes of disaster grow the red roses of success.
Well, thank you. The red rose of St George. I'm very glad. A true English rose from a Scottish rose. Thank you. But let's get back to business. Suella is just being very clear, and she's recognising that the Tories let down their own voters by not dealing with migration, and that we need to recognise our errors before we can grow the roses of success.
There are all sorts of reasons why migration ballooned under your party's administration, and indeed it has proved to be disastrous. But I think we need to be really honest with the British public about our needs as a nation. We are getting older. The needs of an older population are ever more onerous on those workers. In the 1980s, there were in the 1980s, there were 4 workers for every old person in the country who had higher needs. Now, that is almost reduced to 2 workers per old person at the same time as the birth rate has plummeted. So I ask you, in your great position of wisdom and now time, how do you cook up those additional workers if you don't bring them in as a migrant workforce?
This is a very good point, isn't it? That we've got Labour now saying it will control migration. We had the Tories promising it. Both have failed historically. But how are we going to make the economy provide the services for the elderly and so on if we don't continue with this migration?
Can I go back to Suella for a minute?
Yes,
because
certainly.
I just want to say, as a man, you probably can't say it, but I think being in opposition suits her. She's looking very glamorous and quite liberated.
And ditto Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, they both look good in opposition. So there's something for it. Well, and of course you'll find some. No, but I think that everything Suella Braverman says about reform is spot on. I think everything she said in that fascinating interview about stop telling the British people that they're racist is spot on. I think that what Suella says, and actually what Kemi Badenoch was saying in the Shadow Cabinet earlier on today, ironically she was saying we need to stop the leaks from the Shadow Cabinet in this wonderful piece that was obviously leaked to the Times or somehow. But I think that actually now, if you'll forgive me, the post-mortems need to stop, because I think the Conservative Party have been having this slow motion nervous breakdown and the post-mortem, which is necessary, and a kind of pre-mortem leading up to this massive election defeat for a long time. And right now, what true Conservatives want, and I'm speaking as a voter, not as a former MP, I'm speaking as a voter, what people actually want is a Conservative Party that's properly, truly Conservative, that they can vote for. That's why 4.1 million people went to Reform.
Hang on a minute.
This is like, no, let me just finish. This is like a relationship where one person goes on and on and on about what they need and what they want, and it's embarrassing. From the outside, this is embarrassing. Conservative MPs, this endless navel-gazing and tearing each other apart and infighting. If you want to have any chance, use this 5 years to rebuild, to come together and to reform a really inspiring and much needed Conservative Party.
But I mentioned at the top 2 elephants. I've just remembered there's a 3rd elephant in the room, which no one mentioned except Keir Starmer in his prime ministerial acceptance speech, and which directly contradicts what Suella Braverman said there. He mentioned that it was harder for Rishi Sunak to be in number 10 as a man of colour, as an Asian man. Nobody mentioned that on the right. Nobody ever mooted the idea that possibly some of the Conservative vote leached into Reform because some people didn't want Rishi Sunak.
That's such nonsense.
Yes, how do you know that?
Well,
how
look
can
at
you
the
prove what
deputy, Ben
motivates someone?
Habib, the deputy. There are plenty.
And
there were
did
so
Ben Habib win his
many.
seat?
There
Did-
were so
did Ben
many
Habib win his seat for Reform?
There were so many Reform candidates up and down the country of colour.
And did any of them win? Did any of them win their seats?
I simply do not believe. I know so
You don't
many
want to believe
decent,
it. Of course there
genuine
are. Of course
Conservatives
there are.
who became politically homeless, who voted Reform without a racist or a xenophobic bone in their body, and I mean that genuinely. I think that's really unfair.
Nobody who told me that he or she was voting Reform during the election campaign. I was canvassing solidly for the period, meeting
I know, I
hundreds and
just see
hundreds
you
of
worked
people.
hard, hence the flowers.
Thank you very much. Mentioned that as a reason for
they
not
wouldn't
supporting the
take-
Conservatives, or even hinted at it. I think that's very unfair.
I'm not
And
suggesting-
there's no
really
evidence
wrong.
for it.
OK, so what
It's
do
a-
you understand? Except there was huge amounts of anecdotal racism being spewed off mic by those Reform helpers and volunteers. We know that. 'cause
that was very unpleasant.
Anybody
into
can
the
be an
public
activist.
domain.
Anybody can
Right.
put a Reform rosette on and say, I'm a candidate.
And those
I'm a...
anybodies have a vote. Like it or hate it, they
But
have
Tessa,
a vote.
what you're saying is if people in this country are genuinely concerned about migration and about the soaring levels of net migration and all of that, they're effectively racist
I'm
and
not saying,
xenophobic.
no,
and that's so
not fair.
unfair.
You're
All right.
conflating 2 different points.
All right, well, we're going to have to
2
come back
separate
later.
points.
Thank you to my panel.